Tonight, we'll be talking about pandemic turned hysteria. In 2020, the world was struck with a virulent and unusual disease. And no, I'm not talking about what you might be thinking. I'm talking about madness. This madness infected the minds of politicians, medical academics, and members of the media. And from there, the madness spread throughout American society, causing waves of irrational fear and prompting many to eagerly relinquish their rights in the name of health or safety. Attaching itself to the cells in our social nervous system through the spike proteins of lies and hysterical projections, the disease injected totalitarian RNA into our court systems and governors' mansions, inducing a devastating cascade effect. Mask mandates, social distancing rules, economic shutdowns, and stay-at-home orders. The disease threatened to replicate throughout every institutional organ it assimilated, or completely shut down any that resisted. The result? 25% of adults aged 18 to 24 seriously considered suicide in the month of June 2020. There was a 24% increase in fatal vehicle accidents. We went from record unemployment to 1/7 of the working age population being out of work. That's 30 million people. Store shelves emptied of essential supplies such as toilet paper and reasonably priced food, and many people died, unnecessarily. Though the final death tally for 2020, according to the author Alex Berenson, who you will talk to shortly, was, quote, slightly more people worldwide than diarrhea or Alzheimer's disease. Many of those people did not have to die. A shockingly unethical class of medical experts made decisions not based on what was best for the patients, but for their own comfort and for the betterment of their brand of elitism. At least twice in 2020, the formerly respectable medical journal The Lancet served this call to action. Once, a group of scientists issued a statement meant to tamp down suspicions on the virus's CCP origins, calling for others to, quote, stand with our colleagues on the front line. In May 2020, The Lancet struck again, publishing research critical of hydroxychloroquine as a cheap and readily available treatment option. This was amplified by the Washington Post, which describes it as follows. Anti-malarial drug touted by President Trump is linked to increased risk of death in coronavirus patients, study says. But according to Berenson, quote, less than 2 weeks later, The Lancet was forced to retract the report after its authors could not prove that their data actually existed, end quote. What could have animated such brazen malfeasance? Pandemia depicts an elite class unhinged and hungry for power, seizing their opportunity to take it. President Trump became involved, repeatedly speaking positively of hydroxychloroquine's potential. The drug suddenly became a pawn in the larger battle between Trump and the media over Trump's response to the coronavirus. Because Trump had supported it, a shocking number of reporters and scientists seemed almost to want the drug to fail. In response, Fauci pushed remdesivir, an expensive new treatment that eventually had to be discontinued when the data proved the drug did nothing to stop the spread of the virus, nor significantly reduce deaths. But the temporary push to use the drug earned maker Gilead a windfall of at least $4 billion. One of the biggest atrocities committed by doctors and nurses stemmed from the early adoption of aggressively ventilating patients hospitalized by COVID. These patients had to be heavily sedated because the process of ventilating is extremely painful. Many were also subjected to, quote, high-pressure ventilation in order to keep their lungs inflated. This very process destroyed their lungs. A study at the time revealed only 38 of 1,151 ventilated patients in the Northwell Health Hospital system in New York were discharged. That sounds less like medicine and more like blood sport, a situation that pits the sick against their caretakers in a battle for survival. Among these details, Berenson picked up on a few facts that people noticed at the time, one of them being that the driving factor in adopting ventilation was the fear of doctors and nurses being around the sick and being breathed on by the sick. He writes, quote, medical staff knew that ventilators could help protect them. Intubated patients no longer coughed. They also did not need to be treated with nebulizing masks that put even more virus-filled droplets in the air. A March 27, 2020 statement from the Food and Drug Administration offered a revealing look into the agency's priorities. Quote, FDA takes action to help increase U.S. supply of ventilators and respirators for protection of healthcare workers' patients. 2 days later, a young physician in New York had explained exactly what the FDA meant, writing that her hospital was intubating patients quickly to, quote, avoid aerosolizing procedures to protect staff. She would later delete the tweet. This irrational fear that caused healthcare workers to see their charges as existential threats was itself informed by the apocalyptic fantasies relying on bunk models that had no business entering serious discussion when dealing with ending the pandemic. But the media wanted the clicks. Local dictators were drunk with their newfound power. And behind it all, the behemoth pharmaceutical industry was relentlessly pushing for bigger profit. And for all these institutions, the cost, our very lives and livelihoods, wasn't even a consideration. 2020 was a year many people saw their families shrink. Some were orphaned. Arguably, the biggest orphan of all was us, the American people. We were orphaned by our media figures, our politicians. We were separated from our loved ones, from our school, and even from our church. That was the year we discovered, to our horror, the extent to which we are truly alone. The false idol of short-term gain kept these institutions rather silent and willing to comply with this madness. But later, after some time passed and people were able to look back, many realized that we did not speak up. We abandoned any sense of moral obligation or duty to speak up for our freedom. But what's to be done about it? Our founders, in their wisdom, maintained that our rights are inherent. No committee or Congress or conspiracy can take those rights away. No matter what force, fear, or subtle coercion is thrown at us, we will not relinquish the responsibility to protect the principles of the founding for our children. That means speaking up in public forums. That means not complying with unjust mandates, rules, and laws. That means voting for what matters most to us. And that means not relinquishing in fear when threatened or intimidated. In some ways, it means something we aren't used to. It means we take a page from the progressives, throw caution to the wind, kick out the focus groups, and let our agenda speak for us. Where the media, government, and so-called experts were happy to watch us die by the hundreds of thousands, we will unshackle the individual from government, snatch liberty from the corporations, and usher in a new golden age of American society. It is time for the followers of Fauci to learn hard moral lessons on responsibility and accountability for the suffering they have caused. This is, after all, our lives and our children's lives that they are toying with. Ours is a culture counter to their new normal. We do not accept this new normal. To discuss this further with us, we have our guest today, Alex Berenson. Alex Berenson is the author of the brand new book, Pandemia: How Coronavirus Hysteria Took Over Our Government, Rights, and Lives. Berenson covered the drug industry and financial fraud for the New York Times. He is also an Edgar Award-winning writer of best-selling thrillers and a graduate of Yale University. Alex, thank you for being with us.
Danielle, thanks for having me.
I loved reading your book, Alex. In your book, Pandemia, you carefully track the path of this disease as it infected America through the cracked bulwarks of our institutions. I want to start by asking you, though, to tell us a little bit about your experience at the New York Times.
Well, my experience at the New York Times, despite what people would like to think, was actually really good. And that's funny because that's both on the left and on the right. You know, if you go on Twitter, you'll see people saying I was fired from the New York Times. I mean, that's completely false. I left on good terms. I was writing novels that were quite successful, and I decided, I was writing a novel a year because that's sort of the commercial schedule, and I decided I wanted to leave the paper. And when I was at the paper, I never really felt overly politically constrained. I wrote a lot of investigative pieces about, drug companies and other, business investigative pieces. I also got to do some foreign reporting. I was in Iraq for the paper. I really liked the New York Times, and I never felt that they wanted me to do anything but report, the truth of the stories that I was on to the best of my ability. I fear that that has changed in the 11 years since I since I was there. But in my 10-year career, I never had a problem with the paper.
That's great to hear. Tell me a little bit about how you think things have changed. In what way do you think the media has changed over time, perhaps there, but also at other places?